Hello and welcome to the From Ground to Great show. I am your host, Daniel Ruiz Jimenez, and today we have the awesome Alex Silva Sadder. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Good. Yeah, great day. Man, we had a lot of great content that I was like, we were talking about how how conversations happen pre-podcasts, and I was like, I got to turn the button on to start it.
Yeah, that's as we were saying, there's all kinds of good conversations that come out of that sort of casual before and after environment. So people come to show up to do an interview or a TV show or whatever, and then there's that getting to know you warm up, and sometimes people just start transition into talking, and you get the great material there. Or once it's all over and everyone's relaxed, okay, yeah, we did the interview, and then they start a conversation about some topic. Yeah. And it's like there's more great material right in that. So
Yeah, I feel like, or when I had a Blue Yeti mic, but I don't know why I could just never. I had to edit it way more than I'd like to. I don't know if
because of noise levels or
yeah, like everything around me, and then I had the AC on. I was like, all right, awesome.
Yeah, that's controlling the acoustic environment you're in when you're doing audio work is very important. That's why in the movie industry, a lot of people don't realize, but the sound that you hear in films is mostly reconstructed on a soundstage, or in the edit booth. The only location sound they tend to use is dialogue, because it's only recently have they started coming out with tools that allow you to modify the ambience of dialogue, right? Make it sound not just like, large cathedral, small room, that type of thing. But to get like sound prints essentially of a room and apply it to different recordings, and it can actually adjust everything, so it really sounds like it was recorded there. But in the past, everything else it's actually done on sound stages. Foley artists re-recording what they call ADR, which is automated dialogue replacement or additional dialogue recording. It's had different meanings, that acronym, but all those little effects you hear, the crunches, the door opening, that is actually, they just add it, or they don't have it, because that's another thing. If you're a director, you want to control what you're presenting to the audience. Do you need to hear every noise on the street, or do you just need to hear the car going by and a few traffic noises so that, mentally people, they're on the street, and then they don't think about it? Because otherwise, you get a very specific sound. Oh, what's that tink, 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 tink in the background? And that can distract an audience, and that's not what they want for their story, usually, right?
I feel like it's, I've seen cartoons where they'll exactly what you're talking about, because they'll have the cartoon in front of them, and that's when I feel like you have like the most fun. I feel like you get more creative.
Oh, those Foley artists, I mean, I've seen behind the scenes stuff of them at work, and, sometimes they're just having so much fun. Like, especially, I think if you look at the older Disney stuff, because they're doing the cartoons, right?
Exactly.
So
I feel like you have more freedom.
And the sound doesn't have to match what's on the screen. They can use any sound. It's what the sound they want to make. That's the sound design element of it. It's not like, it's a cup that spilled, we got to use that. You can make some other noise. Like they used to use, people punching turkeys and things for the sound of punches, So like if Rocky's in the meat locker and he's punching a side of meat, maybe somebody would record that, or maybe just somebody records slapping a chicken breast on the kitchen table.
No animals were harmed during that.
You as the audience don't really know, unless you're maybe a sound person is like, that's the sound of a chicken breast.
As opposed to a thigh. I knew different resonance.
There's no bone in that one, I can tell. So, but because I do a lot of sound work, I've really gotten into all that whole side of it, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. How did you get into it, or how did your journey start into doing that kind of work and getting into audio?
Well, it's just been like one of those skills you wind up picking up, because I do a lot of short film work as part of my job, and helping people, work on making short films or learning the process, like high school students, so that they decide, I want to go study this more in college, or, try and get a job. And one of the things that over the years is we've had this transition, which of course a lot of people are like, what are you talking about? From film, do you remember this? It had film strips. It was a chemical process, to digital. And because of that, the equipment got really cheap. The cameras, like you can film Hollywood movies on your iPhone now, as far as the visuals. So suddenly there's this flood of people who are getting into cinematography, the visual, the photography aspect. And of course, I had learned all those things over the years, but people were not paying attention to sound. And this happened quite early on. In fact, on a lot of television shows, people start complaining because streaming, the production ramped up of shows, like just from a few hundred shows to like hundreds of shows. And sound was the thing. Like you'd watch a show and it's like, I can't hear, I can't understand, because there's not enough people who actually learned sound. All the sound people you'd think they get sucked towards music and everything, right? That knowledge. And so the number of location sound people especially for a short film, if you're a student, you're trying to save money, they don't even think of sound. They're thinking of the image and the story and all that. So I noticed there was a real kind of opportunity that if I was going to learn more, and I already knew the visual stuff. I've been doing photography. My dad had a dark room in our kitchen when I was a little kid. So I was like, I'm going to learn more about the sound, because there's more opportunity for work. That's an area that a lot of film teachers, that's usually the last thing they're thinking about. They're teaching the cinematography, the storytelling, a lot more, even just being on set presence and how sets work. And rarely do people talk about sound. And of course, here we have a low power FM here where we're shooting. You can insert a note about that. Yeah. We have a low power FM radio station. So we do a lot of audio things, and people are into music in this town. And there's a guy I work with, Jim Buchanan, who does a lot of live sound recording. So I just talking to him and some of the other retired volunteers that come through here. I think we had a guy named Peter Boehm who used to do sound for television in New York City, like professionally, like Tonight Show level. Okay. Like, so you get these advice from these guys and start realizing there's a lot of opportunity there. And it's an area, of course, people know about sound. Sound goes further back, or as far back as the imagery. So that's the way I went. And of course, sound gear, camera gear, you can get very expensive, but it is a little bit cheaper to start with sound. Yeah. And then as we talk, like Foley, all that. So people are doing short films. They don't think of that. And then when when you add those things to it, they're like, oh, this is starting to sound like what they imagine, right? Because they watch professional produced film and television all the time. And they're like, why doesn't it sound right? It's because it doesn't sound right. And then they learn that. And then all of a sudden you can take a piece of film and change the sound on it, and suddenly it's like, oh, that sounds like a real TV show now. It doesn't sound like something a bunch of students did in the backyard.
Sure, like amateur.
Yeah. Just that alone, because again, it's a subtle psychological effect. Once the audience hears it, they're like, oh, boom, and they don't even think about it anymore. Now they're watching. Now they're into the story because they're not thinking, oh, this sounds like a video camera sound, like that hollow, echoey, whatever it is. Yeah. So anyway, that's how I got into it. And because of podcasting has come along and all these things, it's just all naturally flowed together. And, it's complemented the photography and all that. So yeah, that's how I got into it. And it's been probably the most productive side of things, actually, even though I've done years of work with the film and everything, the podcasting, the audio sound work, it's more intimate. You hear people's voices, like you're doing this show and people get to hear from you, your opinions. So I like it.
Yeah, I like it too. Like, since what we were talking about for podcasting in general, it's a way where it's not an interview, right? It's not, I feel like it's not supposed to be staged. It's supposed to be very organic. You're supposed to let things, sometimes you can come with questions that you want to ask later on.
Oh, yeah. You can make it as scripted as you want.
Yeah.
People do dramas for their podcasts.
Yeah,
right?
It is really flexible, actually. Yeah.
And that was another...
very creative. Yeah, a lot of creativity to the process.
Exactly. And I remember when I was in high school, my roommate, and I had a roommate because I went to a boarding school, he was into audio dramas, and he'd get these little paper catalogs of they came on cassette tapes. You can explain to the audience what is that some other time. But there were some experimental ones that were 3D plays, 3D audio plays. One of them was Stephen King's The Mist, I think. And it was done as a 3D sound audio play. So when you put on the headphones, it sounded like you were there in the story because all the audio had been recorded with a special mic, what they call a binaural, which means, two ear or whatever, oral, not oral in your mouth, oral in your ear. A microphone, and they put basically microphones down in the ear canals of a head that's like a dummy head. And so when the sound gets to those mics, it goes through the ears of the head. And so all the information that your mind needs to create 3D, it's all there. And so the sound, it can be so realistic, and it was so cool. And I always remembered that. And so that's always was in the back of my mind. And of course, eventually that technology got cheaper, the ability to manipulate those sounds. Because, in the early days, sound was on tape and vinyl records, people. So if you wanted to edit things together, you literally had to physically cut up tapes, splice things together, re-record them, overdubbing, these whole processes. Now, everything is digital files on a computer, and you drag and rearrange, and the computers are so advanced as far as mathematics that they can do all this crazy math that's required for physics and audio, fast Fourier transforms and all that. And it can do it instantaneously enough to process the audio and make it sound 3D, move it around on a surround sound presence, because now people have that, right?
Yeah.
It always works great with headphones because it's just two speakers. It's a lot harder to get it when you're doing multi-speaker setups for like movie theaters where they can have like 30 speakers in a movie theater. But yeah, sound, it's really cool.
Where do you think the future of sound's going?
I don't know that it's sound is going anywhere. Like, I think it's reached that level where it's just ubiquitous as far as digital. Like, there's not really any kind of amazing innovation I see in encoding sound. Like, maybe somebody will come up with some crazy wavelet routine that'll make sound even smaller in file size than it is now. But the way they've chosen to encode sound, all that's so standardized, I don't see it changing much. And of course, I see people using sound a lot more. Like, we see the podcast. People now can have all these effects built right into their computers.
Yeah.
So they don't have to go out and do the Foley artist. A Foley artist has to have a little sound studio, and they go out in the wild and they record all these sounds, and you get these libraries of, I went down to Antarctica and I recorded penguins, and I recorded the sound of the waves, and I recorded the ice cracking and all that. So if you're going to make a movie in Antarctica, there's probably a sound library that somebody's done for that. And I'm just making that up as an example.
But it's probably true.
Yeah, but
like sound files.
It saves you money. And of course you could have synthesis, but that just...
What's that?
Where you artificially create the sound. Electronically, right? Because you can record sound, which is you're recording those incoming waves of pressure changes in the air, which is what sound is. But you can also synthesize you synthesize a sine wave, square wave, and by modifying them, you get sounds. The whole electronic music, that's all stems from that. And because the physics and the math is the same, that's another thing. If you study these things, say you're a high school student, if you learn about sound wave, you're learning about the same thing, because electronic waves, sound waves, it's mathematical truths. Like, a wave travels through a medium, right? Whether it's water or air. And if you're looking at electromagnetic waves that go through the air, there's not a physical pressure that's changing like with a sound wave, but the waves, the math, all that's the same, right? Electrical waves, because it's an up, it's a down, there's some, baseline that you're measuring from. And you start to see these mathematical patterns repeat over and over, whether it's in, the sound for something or ocean waves or whatever. It's all related. So eventually, as you get higher and higher into looking into these things, you start to see all those connections. And it helps too, because then you can start applying your knowledge in creative ways. You're like, this concept works really well with that. Let me try applying it over here. And maybe you have to do some shenanigans in your computer to apply that math in a different way. But it's math, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once everything's in mathematical form, you can manipulate it all. And then you say, okay, I want sound or I want light, right? That's another one because people can use these things to control animation. And if sound has been used to trigger things like the control beeping tracks that they would used to have on, back in the days when you're recording on cassette, you might have some kind of background beeping thing in the same way a person has a metronome, right? To help them keep rhythm when they're doing their music. So yeah, it's like the old computer modems. It was like beep, 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 beep,
Yes.
all that. Now it all happens so fast you can't even hear it because it's just a high pitch because it's going. But the computer understands what all that is.
What that means. Or like when I heard that back in the day, I don't know.
Yeah.
But
I do a lot of that as I'm getting older.
Yeah.
So
I'm not even old. Yeah.
Back in the day.
Yeah. I say back in the day because I don't remember this time. But someone was telling me when I was over in Florida when I was working at the airport that to get into I think to get to the internet or to connect the internet it would be like do 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 do.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And it was super. I mean, you can't even compare the speeds. And that's the thing with human beings too, is like the scale. Sometimes the human mind was not made to easily accommodate scale. It's something you learn later. Like, so when people can estimate quantities, there's a dozen of those, there's a few hundred, I can see 1,000, but then you start getting, 10,000. How many people is that? 100,000, 1,000,000. And then you start getting into the gigahertz and all this stuff that computers operate.
Yeah.
And it's like the amount of information there is mind-boggling. This is why we have these problems with people becoming billionaires, because people have no concept of actually how much money that is. And there's a great website where they have, I think it's Elon Musk's wealth, right? And it's compared to like all these other dollar amounts. And they start with like, okay, this one pixel here, this represents like $10,000. So like the size of IBM's revenue in a year is like this marble sized dot here on the screen, which is, however many thousands of pixels. And it goes and it goes. And eventually it gets bigger and bigger until it reaches here's the start of Elon Musk's wealth. And it's just like a vertical wall of color where every pixel represents 10,000 or whatever. And it just goes to the right on the computer screen and you scroll. And you scroll and you scroll. I mean, this goes on forever. And you're like, oh my gosh, it's so much money, like compared to the entire revenue of IBM, compared to the entire revenue of FedEx. Like, it's just insane.
But I don't think it's liquid though. I think they take into account like all the companies and really like, I don't even know if they even separate the fact of the ownership, the amount of ownership he has, like, for example, I don't think he completely owns SpaceX. Maybe he has a lot of other people paying for, equity.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So I don't know if in that case it's like the whole thing or.
What I like is it's not that it's like, oh, Elon Musk is too rich or whatever. It's just like, it's the scale of numbers. It's like when you see, like, say Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's talking about something. Oh, the cosmos, right?
Yeah.
Throwing some reference to Carl Sagan here about the infinite universe and all that. And the scale, it's like people can't, how far away like a light year is. It's like insane.
No.
Like, and that's just one light year.
Yeah, that's hard to imagine.
And it's just the human mind. We can conceive of it intellectually, but we're not good with trying to estimate certain physical experiences. Like, you look out in a crowd, once at a certain point, you're not counting individuals. You're just like, oh, that amount of area, that's whatever. And then you're so small, there's no way you can even see the whole crowd unless you're in an airplane, right? I watched a movie the other day called Uptight, and it starts with funeral footage from Martin Luther King's funeral that was filmed by the director. And so it actually starts with real documentary footage of the funeral, and the crowds in the procession as it was going along the street. I mean, it was just, I've heard of crowds like that, back in the day, various marches on Washington and things like that. But to actually see a shot on film, this isn't a digital or effects or anything, down a street all the way back And just as far as the eye can see, it's just a sea of people, tens of thousands of people walking along peacefully, quietly, following behind the
casket,
in the procession. And it's just because that's not something that you're going to see. Even if you're there in person, you're going to be down at a low level. Maybe you're on a rooftop, as many people were. So you're going to see a little portion of it. But there's certain numbers, right, that we can't just physically expose ourselves to, really. Maybe, walking in some room with 1 billion marbles, if there's something like that. And like, you'd probably they're like, don't step on it. Because if you fall in there, you're dead. Yeah. You're never coming up.
Yeah. You didn't sign the waiver too. So yeah, please don't step on it.
So we have to use our imagination. Yeah. And I sometimes people just don't, so you have these policy arguments. Is that too much wealth, or is that, but they don't really, it's hard to grasp the understanding of what's going on. So you have to kind of maintain an open mind when you read certain things and realize that you might think that's a lot, but you don't really understand it yet.
Yeah.
Until maybe there's some way to experience it. And that's what I mean. Sometimes it's hard. Like, you can jump in the ocean and somebody will tell you there's however trillion many molecules, of hydrogen in there. Like, imagine how much, and that compared to a star is like, it's like, oh, that's like a speck of dust. You guys live on that little dirt ball that's floating around that sun over there. Yeah. Like, over in that galaxy way over there. Oh, yeah, okay, you humans are all right, I guess, but whatever.
Yeah, y'all do your thing. Yeah. I think about that a lot. Like, when I'll get into a moment where maybe very close-minded or not close-minded. I think like tunnel vision on something. And it might be an emotion or something that happened, right? Or something that happened and I tie that to emotion. I'll really like to step back and be like, you know what? I'm like a tiny little speck of dust on this planet. Like, my problems don't matter. I don't. It's like,
they matter to you, right?
Well, but in a way, it gives me like confidence to be like, well, so what if you fail? Right. Or so what if this happened? It's probably happened to a lot of people too. Right.
And that's important.
Yeah.
Like what you just said is very important, is that sometimes people don't cut themselves enough slack. It's very easy to compare yourself to the best of everything, especially nowadays with the internet, and say, I'm not good enough, or I can never reach that level, or whatever. Mm-hmm. And it is important to remind yourself that other people have done it. They've gotten through whatever it is you're about to go through, and that, you can make it to it, but also recognizing, there's going to be steps like the lottery win, like, oh, somebody suddenly drops $100 million in your lap. I'm sorry, but that's not likely to happen.
Yeah. Right? More likely to be struck by lightning. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And actually, every year lots of people get struck by lightning. You look at the statistics, it's like, wow, that many people get struck. And it's like, yeah, but it's still such a rare thing in the big scheme of things. Like, don't worry about getting struck by lightning every day stepping out of your house. Unless like you live in the middle of a permanent storm somewhere, I guess. I don't know if there's something like that on our planet, but like some Skull Island, right?
Yeah,
island off Skull Island. There's always lightning there.
I'm trying to
Giant
think
monsters.
I'm trying to think of what's the place called where it's like the Bermuda Triangle.
The Bermuda, right? Yeah. And that has a storied history in aviation, of course, because the Navy planes disappeared there and all that.
Yeah.
But kind of bringing it back around to what you said with the keeping an open mind about things and this stuff. And that's one of the things I think with business, you have to be able to step back and change that frame of reference. Like you said about getting tunnel vision. Yeah. And that happens to so many people on a project as you get into the nitty gritty and the daily grind of things. And just, you have to survive as a person. You've got food, you've got maybe a family you've got to take care of. There's all these things pulling for your attention. And if you're working on a business, especially, there's so many different things that you can bog yourself down in and forget to take that step back and remember what your overall goal is. Mm-hmm. And so being able to change your frame of reference mentally is very important.
Yeah.
So that's a skill that everyone, as far as personal development, should work on, that ability to step back a bit from your own project, your own life, and just kind of like, okay, where am I going with this? Am I still on track? Because it can be very easy to get pulled in and sucked into details and sucked into solving maybe a problem that, yeah, well, it's interesting and challenging. At a certain level, if you step back and you're like, oh, that's not really actually important for my business, right? Oh, people talk about that, and should I worry about that? Well, maybe for your business, that's not the important thing. So you need to be able to form that sort of mental refocusing ability.
Yeah.
I guess that's what the way I'll refer to it. And it's a very important skill. And, you know, having sympathy for yourself, that's one thing. Challenge yourself and all that, but being able to reframe things. And then, of course, constant learning. And I think this is something that maybe can be an issue for some people, is like, you go through school. School is not always a great experience for people, right? Some people suffer greatly during the years they're in school and high school. There's all kinds of social development going on. It's not just the academics. And so they're like, when I'm out of school, that's it. I'm done. I got my degree or whatever. It's like, honestly, you're going to have to be a continuous learner your whole life, especially with the way technology is changing everything all the time. New technologies come along, improved methods of looking at things, or even if it's not an improved method, there's centuries of history in almost every field you can think of. So there's always things out there that you can learn to improve your own capabilities and your ability to interact with other people, your ability to interact on your business, your passions, your pursuits. And so everyone should try, I think, to develop that continuous learner mindset, because that's the way you'll keep up with things. It's almost like inflation, right? Inflation will eat away at the value of your money.
Yeah.
But time will eat away at the value of your knowledge, because it'll get compressed, essentially. And that's sort of the mathematics looping back around, right?
Yeah.
And so if you want to kind of stay where you are, stay ahead of the game, you got to keep learning.
Yeah.
So
yeah, there's a podcast that I did with Mike Thompson. He is a flight instructor over at Epic Flight Academy, and he was saying that he's like, if you're not learning, you're not flying, you know. And he's like, well, that's why I'm not flying.
Right.
Or, you know, he stopped flying. He'll fly from time to time,
Right.
but he's like, yeah, like you have to constantly be in the game of knowing what new technology is coming out, and revisiting a whole bunch of topics now you might have forgot about. Or there's more ways to get more deep into topics, because I like finding out the more that you dive deep into a topic, the more that you know that you don't know anything. Right? Has that ever happened to you? Like you get deep into something and you're like, wow, I really don't know about this. But then you talk to someone else that has no idea, right?
Right. And they're like, oh, wow, you know so much.
Yeah, I'm like, no, I swear I don't. You know?
Well, those side excursions into like, oh, I better learn about that. I mean, they can take off years of attention. I mean, in a way, sound was like that for me. It was like, sound has always been in the background. I mean, you know, when I was a little kid, we're making the tape and making up sound stories of things like, and then now you hear that you make the sound of the police cars. Oh, the sheriff's here. And he does this, like these little audio plays. So all along I had that in the background, but didn't actually start learning about it until, you know, as a later in life as an adult, because it came back around. It's like, oh, that's a useful skill. Oh, I enjoy that work. And it's the same, like you talk about with the airplane. You can get into how a part's manufactured, why it was manufactured that way, and how improvements could be made to that thing, because it's a physical device. It interacts with the environment in somewhat predictable ways according to the laws of physics and nature. And aviation, you have to start small, right? Because if you're going to get in those planes, you actually need to know a lot. It's not just about getting in there and knowing how to, oh, if I push the stick forward, the nose will go down, and I pull back. Like steering, that's easy. It's like the difference between getting in a car and just driving to the supermarket and like, oh, you want to race Formula One cars. You're going to have to operate at a much higher level of understanding and performance, even as a driver. And as a pilot, you can learn the basics very quickly. But if you don't know the rest and something goes wrong, you're going to be in real trouble. There was a news item that flew through recently about saying, was it John Travolta, like, I thought I was going to die because the electrics went out in the plane. And you realize you're in this metal thing way up in the air, something goes wrong, and you, like, I can see somebody somehow learning to be a fly, right? Knowing that, but of course they don't understand the physics. Like, you think the early pilot guys were like, knew about vacuums and lamellar flows over the wing and all that, right?
Yeah.
They knew it worked, and they knew they had to have those wings. If the wings broke off or got shot off,
they knew it was done. Yeah.
You're in big trouble. You better have a parachute. You better know how to use that. Maybe I was like, oh, I know I've pulled this cord, and they say it's going to open.
Yeah.
And but there's always more, right?
Yeah.
The SpaceX just bought the parachute company. They bought it because it was the knowledge that was embedded into that company about how to make chutes that would be compatible with spacecraft and survive this and survive that. Nobody else had that. And the knowledge had gone so far back in the company, back to the military days when everybody was jumping and the government was spending a lot of money researching all these different things. Like, now it's very specialized knowledge. You don't have a ton of spacecraft going up and using these systems. So there's not a big market for people to like, I can sell 1 million, space capsule parachutes a year. It's like, no, you're going to be lucky if you get the one and it better work.
Yeah, it's probably very expensive.
Very expensive. And they're like, you guys are going out of business. Let's just buy that company and make sure we keep that knowledge. Yeah. And you see that, of course, in a lot of manufacturing as it gets vertically integrated in aerospace. And by the way, that's something, my dad was in aerospace. So I've been exposed to not just flying and the passion for flying, but like the manufacturing and the aircraft and all that. And you see this vertical integration where, of course, the company buys up a supplier because they need to guarantee that they can still have that part. And when you're in an industry where there's a lot of market and there's a lot of competition, so, you have different suppliers, and this factory and this guy says he can make it for this much, and this guy can do a better design, and there's all this going on. And so you don't worry. But after a while, when an industry really matures and then maybe begins shrinking again, like as the aircraft industry unfortunately has, you start worrying about the loss of knowledge, because now the competition has dropped away. There's not enough business to sustain a dozen companies. Now maybe it can only sustain 2 or 3, or things have just consolidated so much, because you used to have Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, all these other smaller aircraft companies, and Lockheed Martin, and then all these guys doing different things, but it's a lot smaller now. Like,
well, they bought them all up,
right? Too. They all consolidated.
Yeah, like what you're saying, like to get the knowledge of,
right. But then that's the problem with the corporate consolidation, though, is that they pull in the knowledge, but then they got rid of all the people. Like, so McDonnell Douglas used to be a very engineering-oriented, pilot-oriented company going way back, but eventually they got bought, and really it was like they stopped listening to the engineers. It all became about stock prices and all the other things that a business can operate on, rather than the product, which is the engineering and the aircraft that you're putting in the air. And it becomes about filling market needs. Like, this airline needs a plane that can fly this market route, and we want to use this much fuel and everything. And it's less about like, we're going to build this really cool aircraft that it can do this, this, and this, and we have to go out and sell those ideas. Like, this is the reason you should buy our plane, because you'll be able to do all these things with it. Instead, it's like, the customer is now completely dictating everything, which, that's good. That's a great opportunity as a business. But also, if you listen too much, you're locking yourself into being a supplier for that one customer.
Or the creativity, right? Yeah. The creativity of being able to create whatever you want to make, right?
Or competing with other products on the marketplace. Because now you're just looking to fill a specific, actually, engineering need.
Yes.
Like, they need something that can get this level of fuel efficiency, and we're going to really work on that, because that number is what's important to them. And of course, once you start getting into certain numbers, you get micromanagement. And, does that number actually serve what the airline's trying to do? And you never know. And oops. That consolidation, I think, it's a natural process, right? There's no arguing that. But and I'm not going to say that I don't think aircraft are less safe. I think they're far more safe because of the mathematics and the engineering that can go into it.
Yeah, it was the time
and the stuff. But there's less, it's a smaller industry now, and there's shortages of pilots because we don't have huge waves of military pilots feeding into the commercial industry. It's way more expensive for individuals, like to get a pilot's license, to get the training. I mean, that's why when I met you and I was like, oh, you went and got your mechanics, is it certificate, right? Mm-hmm. Right. I said, how smart, because you have that that gives you that extra level of knowledge, the extra set of opportunities within the field. And I think almost all the pilots I know, you get into it for the passion of flying, right? Mm-hmm. That's that feeling of like freedom, that you're the bird flying around in the sky.
Yeah.
And just see that and hear that over and over. But of course, there's a lot to support that.
Yeah.
And so you do need to find a way to make a living and everything. So
yeah, I want to get into that because my first boss, I was an apprentice over at, where Davis Air Repair is?
Yeah.
Yep. So that's where I started becoming an apprentice because I ran out of money for flying. So I was like, oh, right. Can I get a job? Yeah.
Yeah. It's like people would get a job in a restaurant because they're like, they like food and they're like, I need a job. And like, how can I get closer to doing
food?
What, yeah.
How can I eat for free? Yeah. But there's one thing that he said that was pretty interesting. He was saying that being a mechanic can make you a better pilot, but being a pilot doesn't necessarily make you a better mechanic. And I remember hearing that, and then he'd also roast on pilots too, which is pretty funny. But because he'd be like, well, anyone can be a pilot, right? But he was also a pilot too, so he had the right to say that. And you know what? To some extent, I see it. There's like, and that's why I want to dive more and deeper into maintenance, because same thing what we were talking about, how you can get into so many different branches of aviation. And for example, the pilot that just knows how to do the stick and rudder, motor skills, as opposed to knowing more of the physics and how an airplane operates and works, and the mechanics behind it. It gives you such a big perspective, and it's given me a bigger perspective too, for flying. I've seen some stuff from being a private pilot that helped into maintenance, but I do see it more when you're flying too. But that industry is just being a mechanic is just so underrated, because they'll say it's like, oh, you're the guy in the sky, but I think the majority, there's a great amount of tools like mentally, and that's when you become a pilot, and that's the reason why I got into it, because I was like, oh, like I hate high school and feel like I'm not learning the things I want to do. And I was in Boy Scouts, and a lot of my mentors are in aviation. They're all pilots. Right. So I was like, okay, I want to be like them. So if I take the steps and become a pilot, then I should be like them, right? And so I did learn a lot. And that's kind of how I lead my life, right? Or I've kind of noticed that I'll take pieces of people and like, okay, well, why is he the way that he is? And how can I maybe adopt that into more? How did this individual learn that? But I've noticed a lot of great tools. Most of my great tools in life mentally have come from the maintenance background, which is very interesting. It's just a way of problem solving that's just more in depth than I think a pilot has to go through. And people think like, well, you have more time on the ground to fix a problem, right? As opposed to, and I'm gonna say not really, because in the airlines they push you, like there's a lot of stress, right? So that's what I'm saying in theory, but it's like, and like the theory and the thing of like, oh, well, at least you're not falling down, into the sky while there's a problem having, problem solve. Yeah, that I understand. But I think there's more complex problems that are going down on the ground. Because a pilot really, they learn some knowledge of how systems work. It's very general knowledge, but everything is from a checklist. So it's just how good you can think of like, okay, so there's a fire. Okay, what does the checklist say? Right? As opposed to when you're on the ground, you're like, okay, so there's a fire at this spot. How many things could have possibly gotten like messed up.
Right.
And how can I prevent that there's another accident because there's a huge hole on this side of the wing, and the owner
you
doesn't
don't
want to
want
buy a
that.
whole new one.
Well, I mean, that's it, right? When you're dealing with physical repair, which that's the mechanic stuff, right? You're dealing with hard physical objects. You're dealing with laws that like this part fits or it doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Common sense. I feel like you deal with a lot of common sense.
You can make it fit if you want. And whereas the flying, it's, as you say, a spectrum, right? First, it says core physical skills, the feel of manipulating the plane and the feel of the plane in the air. Do I feel that pit in my stomach because we're dropping in altitude, right?
Yeah.
But there's no reference.
But you also
right?
can't
Maybe there's a
rely on
cloud.
it. Yeah, you can't rely on.
You can't rely on that. And as you get higher up in the skill level, you have to, of course, then you have to start doing more and more intellectual challenge because instrument rating. Well, now you're relying on knowledge of how to read all these numbers and digits because you look out that cockpit window and there's nothing to see for good reference. And routing and, a gazillion other things. So I can definitely see that. It's sort of like what we were talking about earlier with, you have just basic driving and race car driving.
Yeah.
You have riding a bicycle versus riding a motocross bike, or a high performance motorcycle or whatever. And so I see the different appeal with, of course, pilot versus mechanic. But, the pilots can say what they want. But if you look at any Air Force pilot, right, that guy's got a ground team. And he's not going to disrespect them.
No.
He's relying on them to keep him alive because if somebody makes a mistake, that's the problem for him in the air. I mean, this is a high performance vehicle. He's one of the most engineered, highest performance vehicles there are, right? A fighter jet. And so I don't think, maybe in those lower levels, people, of course, everybody jokes around and everything and teases each other as they do in any field. They do, they do that in the Navy. They do that in everything. But you don't just respect those people because it just makes no sense. Your life depends on them. Yeah. And you would want the same. I mean, if you're an ethical person, I think, you're like, I want them to do the job as well as I would do it, right? Which is like, I'm going to try and do my best because I'm going to keep. Now, there are people who love to take risks, and like, but they don't want their mechanic to take the risk. I was I'm going to go up there and I'm going to do some crazy flying and, like Top Gun, and I'm going to get grounded and do all that. But when he's fixing his plane in the hangar, he's not like, oh, I'm just going to, not put in the oil today and see what happens, So people worry about stuff. Now you get something like a computer instead, right? I don't think there's that bond between the software creators and the end users most of the time. Not in the way mechanics have that, right?
Yeah, because it's a relationship, really.
Right. Yeah. And you can see this in cars, right? There are crappy car mechanics and shitty repair shops and all that. Yeah. Because the car comes in, they do whatever, and then it goes out, and they're not as attached to it. When you get into pilots and mechanics for race cars, for aviation, for people who are engineering dams and bridges, like they're connected to their work in a way that means that they're going to take greater care and quality. Also, because the people around them are not going to tolerate like slacking off.
There's higher standards.
Yeah, there's higher standards. It's like, no, you can't do that. You could jeopardize this entire project, cost lots of people their lives, literally. So, I wonder if there's got to be somebody out there who's studied like, it's the ethics of certain types of work relationships versus others where you're disconnected from the product, disconnected from the end user, like these corporate accountants are like, we can save whatever thing, and they don't even know. They just move money from one column to the other, and they have no idea how that impacts anyone's life, like 4 layers down or 5 layers down.
Well, I feel like they have to be I feel like it's good in a way to have an accountant detached from a corporate company because it's like, hey, come on, buddy, help me out. Like, you could just write this in a different column, and the whole auditing begins.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, and then expecting people to sort out what are just numbers. I mean, you can walk up to a car or a plane and say, oh, you got a flat tire there. Oh, I can see a ding on your, you got a little hole in the wing like you're talking about.
Yeah.
And, with the number stuff and the computer stuff, it's not as easy.
Yeah,
it's not easy to just kind of glance at it and go, I see that you eliminated that division of 60 people over there. And that saves us a lot of money.
Yeah, it's like, yes. Okay, you're right. Maybe not. Well, it's more for the finance. For the finance crew, where they're like, they're the ones really interpreting the numbers of what's going on. Like, well, what does that mean for those 60 people? Yeah.
Well, that's the thing is hopefully they understand what it means in terms of real human value. And you see that too on the same side with creative companies and stuff like that, because there's always the executives looking to cost cut. And it's like people who manage creative people understand you have to support that person. It's not just about getting a product out, because what's coming out of that person is creativity. And the way they're going to do that is by feeling secure and comfortable, right? So if you've hired somebody, even say an engineer, because you want him to design a new turbine for your engine, if he's stressed out about feeding his kids and all this other stuff, he is not going to do as good a job as if you're paying him a good salary. He has the health care, his family, he knows he's got steady employment, because you're not going to, the company isn't in trouble and is going to suddenly turn around and say, hey, we don't need you, right? Yeah. Because Pixar, and these are some of the business books that I like for operating at this level for creative businesses. The guy, Ed Catmull, who's one of the founders of Pixar, he's not as well known as Stephen Jobs, obviously. Managing the output of creative people, you have to kind of create security for those people to work, and they need time to work. And so there are many managers in the creative industry, and we saw this with the strikes, that don't understand how those people operate. And then, of course, there's also the argument that, because they think about creative things, they don't worry about finances. They don't worry about that, which if you're a business, you have to worry about that, right? The salaries for these people have to be paid. And I think, what's the other book? Oh, Reed Hastings in his book, Netflix, The No Rules Rules.
Okay, nice.
Those books, because they're managing creative people. And so you have to kind of create this environment where those people can do their work, they can thrive, but they can still operate within the needed constraints for the rest of the business to operate. Because you can't just have the creatives go out and and we need more money, and we need more money because we want to do this and we want to do that. And it's like, well, wait a minute, we're creating an entertainment product here, and there is a reasonable expectation of what we can expect for revenue. And you say it's going to be a #1 worldwide hit, but it's in fact a big risk. This is not engineering where we build the bridge, and if we build it to a spec, we know it's going to work for the most part. Barring some exotic.
Yeah, it's more of an art, really, when you're talking about dealing with people and getting.
And that feeds right back into people management. Right?
Yeah.
People have a creative element, and if you don't know how to manage that desire, even if they're in what you would call a routine or boring job, you're going to have issues. And nobody wants issues. I mean, you don't want issues in your life. Why would you want to put issues on other people? People do. People do that. I mean, it's obvious that it happens because, of course, like, hey, I got to worry about what I'm doing here, buddy. You take care of your thing. Yeah. But that short-sightedness, of course, is, what makes things difficult. But, life is life. So,
yeah, there's I don't want to get the names mixed up or anything, but I remember in business class, we learned about the theory of there was a time back in history during the Industrial Revolution where we're like, okay, we need to find and make the most productive worker, right? And so they did a lot of science behind it, and they would say, okay, well, which is the easiest way for someone to maybe lay a brick, right? And then they would time it and see what's the most efficient way. Right. Or for example, they'd standardize a lot of things so that you don't have to think about what's going on. Right. Like for, I believe it's UPS, they have a certain way where they hold their keys. I believe it's in their left hand, and the teeth are sticking out. Yeah. So when they're walking, it's like, well, it's just you don't have to worry about like, where do I put my keys? Okay, am I leaving them in the car? And
if someone comes to grab the package, you can boom punch them in the throat with your sharp keys.
It's some Assassin's Creed kind of thing. Yeah, that's why it's sticking out. Yeah.
This is the Wolverine technique. Yeah. All our drivers use it.
Yeah. Step 1: insert keys between knuckles. Yeah.
Well, that's the worker. That's people get into the efficiency. Like, how can we make this more efficient? Yeah. And there's a good side to that because, like you said, that makes it very easy. It makes it easy to teach a job and bring someone up. But if they don't understand why they're doing that method,
Mhm.
it could create problems down the line, which
Yeah.
is what you see when there's too much of an emphasis on efficiency and all that, and too much emphasis on specialization. It's like, well, now we need that guy to do this job over here, which maybe requires a little bit more thinking. But because all they've been taught is like, just put the brick like that.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't learned about how
Why?
mortar sets
Yeah.
and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So they might not do very well in the next role, because unless that role has been chopped up and compartmentalized.
Well, that's usually how it was a lot
Yeah.
back then, right? But what I was going to go for, or what I was going to lead my point to, is for what you're saying for that Netflix book that you're saying, is that, so there's this theory, I think it's Weber's theory, and there's a pyramid of like needs of people. And if you're able to fulfill those needs, then people are willing to want to do more work. That's more creativity, right? Is probably at the highest peak of that pyramid. But like first is like people need food,
Right.
people need shelter, right? And so they actually went out and created a model, and then people need recognition, right? Of what they're doing. And so you're able to have a model, and I think all those boxes need a tick for someone that's creative. Like you really, you really can't be worrying about like back home, like I just am not making enough money, right, to pay for rent or to get food, or no one really cares about the work I'm putting in. You know,
which is a big one. Right?
Yeah. I feel like creative people really need, like I said, really need all those boxes checked. And to be able to really focus on the work and let go of everything, because you need your mind to really go out there and not have to be grounded in a sense, right? That's not your job. Your job isn't to be grounded. You're supposed to shoot for the stars, right?
Well, it's right. It's the same thing. Like if a guy's you're a mechanic and you're faced with somebody's got the plane and you don't know what the problem is. If you have a clear mind and you're relaxed about your life, you're going to be able to like, okay, let me think about this. Let me go through this checklist, and I'm not going to be angry or tired. I'm not going to be thinking about dinner or the argument you had with your wife, or that your kid wants, oh, I want this or that. Because if all those things in your life are calm, now you can focus on the problem at hand and take the time that your mind needs to solve the problem. Because if you're under a time crunch, which is the worst thing, that's when people take the shortcuts. Yeah, that's when people start checking off things just because they've always checked them off without actually looking to see.
And verifying.
Verifying. And of course, that can lead to horrible accidents, all kinds of problems. And then somebody will later on, oh, well, it's not my fault because I was stressed or whatever. It's like, yeah, but that was your job. And then of course, oh, but my wife, and it's like, when you're the boss, do you want to hear, like, you should care about your employees, but at the same time,
you got an aircraft that's got to go out because your other person,
it's like, what about everyone else's life? They're worried about making their life work and their money work. So, I think there's a greater recognition of that for now. Sure, I don't think back, if you look 40 years ago, you heard as much about the needs of individuals and the workers and all that, because you read all the business managements. This is how you get more efficiency. This is how you get more effectiveness, because that's right. The big thing is always, I got called in the, would you rather be more efficient or more effective? They're testing it out. It's like, well, effective, right? Because who cares if you're efficient if you're not effective? But people will look at those numbers and like, oh, we got to get that efficiency up. We got to get throughput up. We got to get this up, without thinking about why that needs to happen necessarily. Or maybe they do. Maybe if you don't get those throughput up, you're not going to make your delivery on time, and the whole project is going to go south. But another thing is explaining those goals. Like you said, people need goals to reach for and know that their work is mattering. So if you're telling your people on the line, you got to do this, but you're not explaining to them how their work is impacting everyone. If you don't have that sense of teamwork and camaraderie, which it's easy. You go back to the war, people that was their goal. Like, we need to win this war. We need to work together in this factory, right? We need to have all the women on the line building these planes and making the rivets and all that stuff. And don't give me any nonsense about whose work it is. It's like, this is what we need to do to win this war.
Mm-hmm.
And, because of course, business is war. You can read the Sun Tzu's book and all that. So I lost my thread, but anyway.
No, you're right. You need to have a key purpose of what's going on.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
Yeah. And if you, I was gonna say something about how. Oh, so there's another thing I read in business, or I learned in business, is that people are actually willing to. It's not that they're willing to work for less money. It's just that, like, let's say the quality of life for someone in a business is maybe not so great. Now we have to look at, okay, let's look at the pyramid, or let's look at the chart. Right. What things do we give the employee to be able to get back to a higher quality of work and effectiveness too, right? Because it's the combo of efficiency and how effective you are.
And not everything is about money.
And it's not. I was gonna say they've noticed that it's not always money. If you give them like a reason and flexibility, if you give someone flexibility and give them more like independence in what they're doing in their work, as well as reminding them a purpose of why they're doing it, they're willing to work in a way, right, for less money. It's not the underlying factor, as opposed to just giving them money, but they still have no purpose and they don't have any independence. They're still going to be upset.
There's a very interesting thing about that, and that basically there are things that you can do to create the conditions where people will naturally do the things that are beneficial both to them and to you. Mm-hmm. One of those things is doing your job efficiently. If you hand somebody the box of parts to be assembled, right? And you say, oh, okay, this is exactly what you got to do with each one of these. And maybe that's the most efficient way you've discovered. But if you give that person the opportunity, a person naturally will learn to optimize the work they're doing because they want to do less work. Mm-hmm. And if you're just going to claim that benefit back for, you can do 100 of those an hour now. Okay, well, now I'm putting all that extra work. But if you just say, you've just freed up like 10 minutes of your time. Now you can relax. You can do whatever you want with that time. Mm-hmm. That person's going to be like, great, because I've learned to make my job more efficient, and I get to keep the reward for that.
Yeah.
And I'm still meeting the goal of however many an hour I'm supposed to do. And people will always look for ways, like, any repetitive task that you've been asked to do. Eventually you're like, how can I speed this up? How can I make this easier on myself? Yeah. It's a natural self-interested inclination. And as long as a boss, you're not greedy and like, let me claim all that benefit for myself.
Yeah.
You're going to get a healthy, happy person, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's every time that you're telling the person, no, you have to do it this way. No, you're not allowed to have creativity. You're just a cog in my machine. Of course, no one's going to want to live like that. That's going to be where they're like, I just go in, I punch the clock, I do my work, and F you all, and I'm going to go home, and I don't like work, and it's just a job. And yeah, there's that, but it's a terrible way to live. Mm-hmm. Because in your life, you're probably, at least early on, you're probably going to have to work for other people. You're going to have to do work, whether it's for yourself or something else. We have to do physical things in life to get by, whether they're for ourselves or for other people. Like, the world isn't going to just suddenly evaporate and magically produce food and the shelter and things in front of you. You're going to have to do something to get those things. Because that's the thing. We're all given sort of a random start. People forget. It's like, none of us have chosen our parents and our circumstances in life. That was just what we randomly got, in a sense, right? We're born to a set of parents. We're born in a certain culture. We're born in a certain location. And we have to kind of find our way to where we want to go, decide where we want to go, and then find our way there. And so in that sense, it's kind of, it seems very unfair because some people get a real big head start on certain things. But then you look at some people like, I wish I had that life. Or like, you got to do this when you were younger. And it's like, yeah, oh, I did all these things, but I didn't like it. And I went and did something else. I was like, what, are you crazy? Like, I would have loved to do that. And then people get jealous of other people's stuff and they get resentful because they look at other people's lives and they said, oh, if I had had that life, I would have done, I'm stuck here doing that. You got to like, okay, change your circumstances.
Yeah.
You take the initiative because, again, it's super rare that someone else is going to come along and say, hey, I noticed this, and that. And it does happen, but it's rare.
Yeah.
Let me take you over here and show you how you can do that differently, and it's going to benefit you more. And maybe that even benefits the person who's showing you, because we want the world to be a better place.
Yeah.
That's why we share knowledge. That's why, you're doing this podcast, right? To share what you've learned. I came on as a guest to share some of what I've learned. And I know that even though it's not like a direct thing, if this helps somebody make their life better, that makes the world better for all of us, including me.
Yeah.
If the people I'm around aren't stressed about how they're earning their living and how their life is going, then they're not going to ask me to absorb any of that stress. Like, hey, can you help me with it? Like the dreaded, hey, can you help me move this week? I've done that, and I've had people help me move, and it's great. But, it's like sometimes you enjoy doing those things. It's like it's your family, it's your brother or whatever. And other times it's like, oh, I was really hoping to watch this movie this weekend, or I wanted to go fishing with my kids. But, and I'm not saying everyone should turn down their friends when they ask them to help move. I'm not saying that at all. Help the people you care about. Help the people that you love.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good segue going into personal growth. And for me is I had this conversation with someone in a hot tub, and like all great conversations happen. Yeah.
You should do the podcast from the hot tub.
I know, that'd be a great business idea. Imagine having I wonder how that could work. Like have the same setup, like the stick.
Waterproofed.
You have like a little bag over it or something.
Yeah, be careful not to electrocute yourself. That's always the danger.
Don't drop the mic in the water. That's funny though. But yeah, there's something about it. But anyways, we were talking a lot about I don't want to get too political, so I won't go too into it. But it's like, there should be a lot of stuff that should get improved, and not everything's perfect. I'm like, but yeah, and they're like, and this has to happen, and this has to happen, and I'm like, yeah, dude, but that's kind of how life works. You can't. If there's maybe you might want to go and dedicate your life to change something, so that other people can then benefit through a program that maybe is created for everyone to access. That's a beautiful thing. But for a lot of majority of people, they need to fix their problems that are immediate in their life. So instead of kind of adopting a victim mentality, which I've seen in my generation, it's just very evident. And it's really sad that they'll blame a lot of what happens because of what you're talking about, like I like to call it like the genetic lottery, which is like you get born in a certain place, and a huge factor of that does happen in the game of the life of Monopoly, right? What we have, it's kind of, but I think that it's so much more than that. That a lot of the people of that are self-made millionaires is way bigger. We looked it up. It was 67% of people self-made millionaires here. So, and most of them you listen to that are these gurus or that are telling you they came from a pretty shitty life, really shitty, very low. Maybe something domestic happened from a poor neighborhood. That's really the reality of a lot of these people that. And then people just want to be like, well, no, but they, they got it lucky. It's like, well, I'm sure they found people that helped them focus their redirection of focus, right? From being like, hey, maybe you should start looking at this. But I think the difference is that instead of becoming a victim of their circumstances, they had to flip the switch where they said, well, this is going on to me, and maybe I can't change this, but I can react.
You can choose your reaction.
I can choose my reaction of how I'm going to choose how this event changes me, and maybe I can go and find people that are willing to help me redirect me, because I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I have a good idea of how to look for it, right? And I think we have an innate nature of when we want something, the universe tends to give it back to you. And it can be as spiritual as you want it to be, or I think it can be as very like, you know, you are thinking about something all the time. Your brain is going to continuously in your subconscious think about it. You are what you listen to. You are what you eat. You are what, you know, of information you consume, right? And so that's a good segue to go into how you got into personal growth, because there had to have been some point in your life where you had to flip that switch of having to be like, okay, well, there's something that I can do, right? And maybe I don't know how, but there's a way, and you decide to look for that. So I'm curious about how your journey was like that for you.
So I think the thing that probably, obviously circumstances up to a certain point, you start out, like you said, a genetic lottery, that's another thing, right?
Yeah.
We don't choose our genes. Like that's what we got. So some of the health issues we face and things like that, it's nobody's fault. It's just like, that's the way it is. And of course we want to try and improve our health and fix some of those things. And, you know, people are against genetic, in medicine, you know, oh, well, genetic engineering and that, but it's chemistry. I mean, we can make positive changes. And as long as we're being careful about the way we manipulate the genes and cells and stuff, there's all kinds of advances that are coming down the pipe. That's going to be, the next century is not really, I think, going to be the computer and math stuff that advances the most next, because that's all a mechanical thing that follows the laws of physics. But medicine and new drugs, new cell therapies, gene therapies, all that, because the computers are going to help process all the information, the vast seas of possibilities that are out there as far as combinations and proteins and stuff, right? Computers can sift through that data, say, oh, here are all the new compounds. Like DeepMind just did that thing. Oh, here's 40,000 new materials, crystals to check out, because they have possibly the traits you're looking for as far as a new powerful crystalline structure for an alloy, or a new drug therapy that will work a certain way on certain classes of viruses or whatever. So that's great. That's all really good. We should keep doing that.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
Then there is, like you said, there's the internal, like your attitude. You can control how you face life. And this is the big thing with, I said, maybe American individualism. I think it's part of the difference between sort of generalized Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. And I mean, that's very, very loose. So I don't want to get like, it's not about like, oh, you're from this area, you must think this way, because people are individuals. But when I was in high school, we had a class, I think it was junior year, comparative religion. So got to study Buddhism was one of the religions, Islam, and of course Christianity, and then a few little details here and there about things like Judaism, right? Because that's a variant, you know, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they're all on a certain spectrum of connectedness, right? And we didn't do so much, I think, on Hindu religion, or, you know, like Zoroastrianism, some of the older stuff that goes way back. There are people practicing that, but we don't think of that as a modern religion for sure. And in Buddhism, of course, they talk about meditation, and it's about mindset. And so there was one of the books we had to read, was this one called The Empty Mirror by this Dutch guy. And I don't remember his name, but he had gone and become a Zen monk at a place, I think, in Japan. And it was very interesting. I was like, oh, what's this Buddhism? This is pretty interesting. So read a lot more. And because Buddhism is really about sort of a mental journey towards, of course, you know, people say enlightenment or whatever, but it's about clarifying, and that all started back in actually India, right? And then traveled across China and across the East to where it got and reached different stages of development, different branches, in the same way Christianity has different branches, Islam has different branches. Well, there are different schools of thought in Buddhism, but it's always been not about trying to reach some like supernatural or a God who creates things or destroys things or punishes or not. It's about understanding the human mind. And so the tool that they use for that, right, is meditation, is to relax and not just clear or empty your mind, but also to acknowledge the way your mind is working. Like, why did that thought just come into my mind? But also let it go through. It's just to kind of process that flow of your own internal monologue first. And then gradually you're learning to quiet that, because the more you can quiet it, the more open you can be to just the sensations that are around you, sort of the pure natural stream of experience without labeling what's happening to you. Because that's the thing, is when we think about, we're always putting labels on stuff. Why did that happen to me? Who caused me? Why? They caused my anger. They did this. And that's that victimhood thing that you're talking about. And rather than acknowledging that your emotions and how you can think, it's not entirely under your control, because emotion especially, some of these things are very tied to human biology. The hormones, the adrenaline, physiological reactions, and that's tied into emotion, which then becomes in your rational mind is like, well, why did that happen? I want to have a cause. I want to have an effect. I want that. And part of Buddhism is sort of disassembling that thought process, that you can be more immediately connected to the sensation. It's like when they martial arts talking about that state of flow, which now they talk about in creative things, right? Where you're not like, as things are, this is pink, this is that. It's like, no, you see it and you acknowledge it, but your mind isn't putting a label on it. And so that really helped.
Very fluid.
Yeah. And I started reading about like that. And I wouldn't, people would say, oh, are you religious or whatever? And I'd be like, I'm not like, oh, I'm a Buddhist, because I also recognize with any organized religion, or at least this is the way I feel about it, that they all have their positives and the drawbacks. Why? Because they're practiced by human beings. And I would think most religions acknowledge that human beings are not the perfect state of everything, right? They have the potential to get there. Under almost every religion, there's a potential to, live the perfect life, develop the perfect mind. Not too many people talk about the perfect body anymore, because we all understand that that's like, everyone's body is different, and nature has constraints.
Yeah.
And so I studied that, and not really deeply. Like I'm familiar, but I'm not like, oh, I'm this type of Buddhist, or I can't sit there and rattle off all the different sutras and different things, because that wasn't really what I was interested in. I was interested in more in the process. And I know that the Tibetan Buddhism, they did. There's a guy who's a Frenchman who became a spokesperson for the Dalai Lama. And what they really tried to do was combine sort of like, well, the Western thought and science, that's one way of looking at the world. And we have this traditional way that goes back thousands of years as well. How can we reconcile some of these things? Well, let's start doing scientific studies on the benefits of meditation and seeing how the interaction. So let's compare to some of this stuff that we receive as what we might think of early on as traditional folk wisdom, right? But also there's a lot of developed philosophy. It's just that it's not as accessible to the Western people because it's occurred in different languages and different cultural backgrounds, and also some of it a long time ago, right? Whereas in the Western tradition, we've kind of settled on English as the way of communication amongst each other, even if that's not the language.
Well, it's newer and it's more standardized.
Yeah, and it's standardized, which is a big thing with Western stuff, is like, let's try and standardize it. But it's great because they found lots of things. Like, I don't want to say that any particular military unit does meditation or whatever, but part of like advanced training, right? When you get into things like the SEALs and stuff, part of what they're learning, it's not just physical conditioning, it's mental control, right? Learning how to recognize the things that control your adrenaline, your fear, your focus, physical things as well. Like that's why they make them sit in the ocean. It's not just so they can learn how to survive sitting in the ocean for hours, but so that they can learn to mentally overcome the strain of their body telling them, I can't do this, and saying, no, your mind is in control. You can push yourself far further than you imagine, right? And you have to learn how to do these things so that under stress, you'll have a clear mind so that you can operate and keep your life intact and the lives of your teammates intact so that you can carry on your mission. And of course, that's the military, but people in other fields, like when they want to learn, one of the things they go to is meditation to learn how to control their mind. And it's just a tool. And it can be a lot more than that, but I'm not promoting it as anything more than just a tool. And so I got into it, and I've seen how that approach just, you can apply it in so many different ways. Just, think about things, think about how you're reacting to things, understand that you can control your own emotions. How you react to things is really, it's all about that. Like, why is it that some people see something in a movie or whatever, and they can be emotionally traumatized by it, and other people can see it and say, well, that's a movie. It's not happening to me. I understand it. I process it intellectually, but I don't let it affect me. And part of that is because some people are able to divorce themselves, from how they let emotion affect them versus like, I'm going to control how I react. Like it's not, you're making me angry. It's like, why am I letting myself get upset by what you're saying?
Yes, definitely.
Right?
I think separating your emotions is going to be, it's very difficult, but I think you can learn how to control them by asking yourself those questions.
Right. Exactly. How you react to your own feelings, your own
it's
emotions.
like, well, why am I getting upset right now? Right. Like, it's like, there's going to be things that automatically are gonna, I don't want to say like trigger, but so an event's going to happen and your body is going to automatically want to give yourself a certain emotion. But if you practice enough times as to, wait, why did that upset me? Is it really me, or is it something going on with him? And you just analyze it. The next time that it happens, you might be less likely to react in the same way because you're like, okay, well, this has happened to me before, and now I'm able to take the situation differently because now I know better and I've analyzed it as opposed to just kind of being a bystander of your own emotions and what's going on. Because that's really what happens. I think a lot of people will just let emotions happen to them without really questioning as to where that's coming from.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing is because there are people that will tell you, oh, they did that to you. In other words, they feed into your negatives thing, and not even intentionally because they're just trying to, they love you and they support you, right? You think about your parents, oh, honey, yeah, that's so bad or whatever. And like, how often does somebody come, and this, I mean, it's happened like the tough guy on the crew. What are you crying for? Like, that thing just fell on your foot. So what? Move on, dude.
Yeah,
It's like stuff happens.
Yeah.
Right. So you have the people that will express sympathy and all that, and maybe unintentionally encourage your emotional, I'm not in control response.
Or
and then
it's
some
not your
people
fault,
come and say, hey, you're a rational human being. That is the power you have that animals don't, is that you can think about your own thoughts, not just think, but think about your own mental process and change your reaction and choose to change it.
Yeah.
You're a free individual. Now, there are people in the world that will say you're not a free individual, that you're just an instrument of some higher other thing. And, you can go that way too. But as long as you're aware of those things, you'll be one step closer to controlling your own happiness, I guess I would say it that way.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about in a different podcast how the whole, it's hard to define what you want in life necessarily. I think right now it got very... I think culture really promoted about happiness, but I don't think it should always be about, because you're not going to be, I mean, that's an emotion too. So it's like, you're not always going to, I think you should learn at least, I mean, this is up to the individual, right? But for me, I like to look at it as like enjoy the journey, there's going to be good stuff. There's good in the bad. There's bad in the good. Right. So, enjoy the process of getting back down, or failing, but recognizing that this is the switch, right? You're gonna fail. Everyone here is gonna fail at some point when you start something new. Yeah,
A lot of times.
yeah. It's like
a lot of times.
you definitely will fail.
The math is against you.
Yeah. So
in many ways.
yeah. So what you can do is recognize, how do I learn from this, and how did I become better, right?
Yeah. Look at your own life. I mean, if you think about, like, at some point you were a little kid and you were crawling around and couldn't even walk.
No.
And then you learned to walk. And then you learn to talk, and then you learn to do this, and then you learn to do that. You didn't know how to ride a bike, and now you do. Yeah. Like, look at your own life. You can do this. Like, you shouldn't think, well, people really do. They get down on themselves, and it's a bad cycle. There's a guy who wrote an article once. He was, this is a younger internet thing, but like a guy like you, but maybe 15 years ago, and he wrote an article about artists and how the saddest thing is when people prune their own tree. That's how he metaphored it or analogized it. See, now I like to make up words. The sad thing is they go and before they even try something, they cut off their own possibilities. Oh, I can't do that. Snip, that branch is gone. Oh, I'm afraid or whatever. And rather than addressing the fear, I'm just going to let that decide and snip. And suddenly, instead of this full, beautiful tree, you've got this narrow, scraggly going up in one direction. And then you're complaining because you feel trapped or it's not going. Tree, yeah. And we have love for the Charlie Brown tree. There's nothing wrong with the Charlie. No. It is a living creature. It's an icon. Yeah. But he said that's kind of the sad thing, because a lot of people, they don't even get to the point where other people are telling them they're terrible. They're doing it to themselves right off the bat.
Yeah.
And we have to recognize that, the world is full of different things and everybody's there, but we'd like to encourage people to go a positive route rather than, beating up on themselves. And I get the complaining. We all complain, but try and take steps, and more importantly, it's like we like this whole do unto others, but that is what it's about, because it's like, rather than, if you want positive reinforcement and encouragement in your life and what you're doing, which might be hard to imagine because I understand things get real tough sometimes, but treat other people that way, because each of those contributions helps make it more positive. It's like, what was it Gandhi? Be the change you want to see in the world. I think I don't. I think that was him. But,
sounds about right.
Yeah. So your little contribution helps. So everyone should. I'm not saying like. Well, yeah, I am saying, go on, be positive yourself to other people, because it will help. It'll help you sooner or later. It's like karma. If you believe in karma, it'll come back around to you.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen that in my life, like just trying to help other people. And one day somebody will come and they offer me some help with something that I wasn't expecting. And it's like, oh, that's great. I guess that's that karma thing.
Or you can think about it as Newton's third law, right?
Yeah,
For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
That is, exactly.
What's the reaction? What's the opposite reaction that you want to get? Do you want to get something good or bad? Right?
Exactly. And that's a great way to look at it, because there's scientific truth. Like there's two sides. There's rational and the irrational, but they're both sides of the same mirror. I like to say both sides, not of the same coin, but of the same mirror, because that goes back to the whole empty mirror Buddhist thing. But,
okay. Well, what's that? Explain that.
I could. It's like a Zen cone, right? It's like the empty mirror. It's like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Have you ever heard that as a Zen meditative thing? So one of the things that they ask some of the monks, meditate on what is the sound of one hand clapping. No way. So you can also, another one might be, what is the reflection in an empty, if you are looking in the empty mirror, like what is the reflection in an empty mirror? But anyway, like there's no way, they're not meant to be like, oh, the answer is
no. There's a lot of thought that has to go into it.
And when they test a monk to see if they really understood it, like if the monk goes, nothing or whatever, it's like, obviously they're just saying that they haven't thought about it at all. They'll be like, nope, go think about it for another week and come back next week and tell me what you think.
Yeah.
And again, I don't think there's right answers or wrong answers. That's not the point of these exercises, but that's the thing, is part of the whole process of meditation and monks doing these mantras, and I don't even like to use the term. Teacher and the student. That's one way of looking at it, not master and that kind of thing, because that's a bad connotations, I think. But teacher and student, it's not even like that there's a lesson being taught. It's that by enough exposure, you start to realize, it's my mind that's creating, that it's generating. They asked me that question, but it's all about how you are responding internally, mentally to that thing. And that the constant, it's like being a person sitting in the waves at the shore. Like those waves are going to hit you and hit you and hit you. And sooner or later, you're going to sink into the sand or move or whatever, even if you do nothing. So like if you're a person who's in a monastery meditating, that it's not even about like what is literally the sound of one hand clapping. That's not the point of the question. It's more like the process and the thoughts and how you arrive to that answer, right? The journey almost more than the destination.
Yeah.
And by undertaking the journey, you don't realize it, but suddenly you're at the destination.
Yeah.
Right? You don't even realize you've been on a journey, because of course that's the way a mystical teacher might work. Whereas in a Western environment, it's like 2 + 2 = 4. And just learn that.
Yeah.
And then later on, you're going to find out.
There's a certain way to get there.
Oh, and by the way, there's this weird thing called quantum physics that don't let it confuse you now, but eventually 2 + 2 is not going to equal 4. It's actually going to equal 1 or 0 or some other crazy thing.
Random.
Because when the quantum stuff interacts,
it's random.
Everything is going to not be what you expect, which is, I really like quantum stuff too.
I've been trying to get into learning about it more. There is this podcast that I listen to where they're able to get a simulation of, their goal as a physicist was, and they had a computer programming background. There's another technical word for it, but I can't think of it. And they wanted to get the equation of the universe, but it had to be simple. and from this have a simulation run, and then it was able to see all these theories come up, like quantum mechanics
pop out.
Well,
I mean, maybe we're in that computer running right now. Maybe we are the simulation.
Well, I think not in a literal sense, but I think in a way. I mean, there's a way that stuff got cultivated and created, and I think for physics, physics is like the language to explain what's going on in those terms, as opposed to language as in English or German is to explain or to get a different point across, right, of an emotion or a state of being. Or I think there's a need to express certain things, like, don't touch the fire, right? Fire bad.
It's like, what do you don't use the word fire?
It's
okay.
like,
what's your word for fire?
Yeah.
Okay, don't touch that,
Don't touch
please.
that,
Right? Yeah, because that's the thing is there's that reality. And that's maybe one of the points of Buddhism. It's like, it doesn't matter what you call it. It is what it is, right?
Yeah.
And there's a microphone. In another language, it's something else. In another language, it's something else. They all are pointing to the same thing. And in the Western world, so is this striving for more precision, right? That is a such and such microphone, and it is this color, and it's this particular shade, and it bounces off these particular nanometers and all that, because that predictability, if it's something consistent, will allow you then to predict and control and forecast. Well, if we put that much energy through that conduit, we're going to get what we need at the other end. Whereas maybe the other approach is like, well, if I give you a word and you free associate off of that word, aren't all those definitions that you're giving me part of the definition of that word to you? In other words, we're each sort of a quantum cloud of what we think words and certain words mean. And when we interact, we're trying to clarify what the combination, when you use a word, do you mean the same thing I do? And that's why people have all these podcast discussions, right? Oh, when we talk about social betterment, well, what does that mean? Like, when I say social, what do you think of when you hear the word? So what do you think of when you hear betterment? And that's the whole thing with language, is that there's this constant pull between more precision. It means this one exact specific thing. Use this word. That's not the proper form for that word, right?
Well, that's why there's synonyms too.
And synonyms and multiple definitions.
Because they're not exactly the same thing, but it,
Yeah, and then the creative side, which is let me free associate all. Oh, what a creative combination. That opens the whole door to a whole new way of looking at things because you just associated, the word, the bagel with the universe, like, that movie Everywhere, Everything Everywhere All at Once. And, and there is this trend in popular media, like multiverse. Some of these concepts have been around a long time, but now it's on the tip of everyone's tongue because we have Everything Everywhere All at Once. We have all the Marvel movies. We have all these things that make certain concepts in physics understandable to people who don't know the highly technical terms where all that maybe came from, right? You read Richard Feynman's 6 Easy Pieces and some of the classics of physics, or, Einstein's relativity paper is not that long. It's simple, right? The formula for the universe, theoretically, you would hope is a pretty simple thing. And of course, E equals m squared. Well, doesn't define the universe, but these are simple equations can give rise to incredible complexity, which is one of the things they've discovered in with the math.
Yeah.
Or it's not. Is it discovery, recognition, whatever? But yeah, I don't know. It's tricky. That's why I said about the whole keeping your mind open, being open to learning from people, but also that framing thing.
Yeah, I think it's really
to keep
important.
on your purpose and know, okay, this is not going to contribute further. I need to move on and do something else because, you got to decide where you want to go if you want to be in control of your life. Some people just like to surrender and what I call, be a floating leaf, the leaf that falls down and lands in the stream and gets carried wherever. And there's nothing wrong with that either. People are free to live their life. And if they just want to go with the flow and stuff, that's fine. And, but if you're going to do that, then please don't complain about where the stream's carrying you.
Yeah. That's
It's
right.
like paddle to the bank, get out and go somewhere else. But I don't want to, if I'm floating down and enjoying my lazy day on the river, I don't want to hear you next to me going, where is this river taking? This sucks. Like, well, did you look up on your phone? We should have gone to this other river. Like, are you in charge of your own life, or are you here to relax? Because I'm here to just relax and drift along.
Yeah.
So, that's my only thing where I would tell other people what to do. It's just like choose one or the other, but don't complain to me about how things aren't going the way you expect if you're not going to take initiative to change it.
Yeah. I like to think about it as you can either be like maybe the same analogy where like you can just you can be a leaf on an ocean with a wave and it just pushes you, or
dangerous.
you can be, or you can be the surfer.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you can't
That's
control.
why people love surfing.
Yeah, you can't control the wave, but you can definitely choose how to react with the wave.
Right. And enjoy it, right?
And enjoy it, yeah.
Paddle in front of it in mortal terror of your life, or ride up, and enjoy the thrill of looking out from the top of the wave.
Yeah, because the wave's coming. It's going to come either way, yeah.
That's right.
It's exactly how you react to it.
I mean, it's crazy, right? You look at those YouTube videos and you see people surfing. Oh yeah, a little wave here and there, and then somebody that rides one of those big, like 50-foot, or even it's like, holy cow! Like, it's superhuman, right? We would go, oh, that's superhuman. That guy is on a huge wave that is enormous, that clearly looks like it would kill just like a boat. If a boat were on that wave, it would flip over, It'd be like that movie, they got the boat flipped or whatever. What's the storm one?
I don't remember. Yeah.
The one with Mark Wahlberg. I mean, it's a sad story, but it is the story of the sea, right? People go to sea and people are lost at sea.
Yeah.
And some people find new shores, what they call new shores, and or some people go out, catch a bounty, return, come back with riches, untold riches, the golden fleece or whatever.
Yeah.
They come back.
Well, people say in aviation is like, if you're going to go up,
Yeah.
you know you're coming down.
Yeah.
It's like, well, it depends how you choose to come down, you know?
Because in aviation, there is assumption like you're going to come back down to the ground at some point. Because otherwise, you're just going into space, and it's like, you know.
No. Well, that's aerospace.
Yeah, it's a whole different.
Yeah.
A whole different thing, and that flying. I mean, I think that's what draws so many people is that desire to fly and be that freedom of motion, right?
Mm-hmm. I think same thing with like surfing, kind of.
Yeah. Well, did you ever? There was a movie, The Sword. I think it was Disney's The Sword and the Stone. But at one point, Merlin turns King Arthur into a bird, right? And so he experiences like, what it's like to be a bird and everything. And I remember as a kid, just like, think all the time, what is it like to fly? Like to be a bird, dreaming that you were the hawk or maybe even the geese that you'd see up in the sky, as they commuted in the evening from north to south. Because when I was growing up, they still had those seasonal migrations of lots of birds. We're in a different part of the country, so I don't see it as much. But even back home when I'm around my parents, you don't see those big flocks of geese at certain times of year migrating from Canada to the south or wherever. And of course, if you go further back in American history, there was all kinds of different avian migratory patterns over the United States.
Yeah. It's cool how we could kind of predict them. Like same thing with the monarch butterflies. You can predict kind of their path, and it's like it's ingrained in them, which is pretty interesting in itself.
Well, it has to do with that magnetic. They can sense
they actually do. They literally can sense the mag.
Yeah, and see, that's I think what's coming around is, and that's I'm glad people understand quantum stuff, because I think that's actually the way a lot of it operates. And I think the way information is encoded on our brain, it's not like people think of the way words are printed in a book or something, like there's some kind of physical representation in the brain, but it isn't. It's thoughts, and it's actually all electrical patterns that are imprinted. And because they're electric, they can have quantum properties. So in other words, information can be encoded in the electrical field surrounding the neurons in a quantum way, and there's an interface where that electrical charge causes physical changes in the neurons, so that when the charge comes through again, it gets a similar pattern, or certain connections are reinforced. So like now the electricity can flow through next time a little easier or a little more difficult. And because of all the infinite it's not infinite actually, because there is a physical number of cells. There is some mathematical limit in a certain sense, but not when you get into quantum, which is what makes it interesting.
Different rules of physics.
Right. Yeah. And how much information can be encoded on, say, one cell versus whatever. But if a cell has this almost infinite surface area, can't you encode almost infinite on a cell? Yeah. Which there's a great book called Scale by, I think its name is Jeffrey something, and I think that's with a G. And there's a place called the Santa Fe Institute where it's like the Xerox PARC of complexity research. So Xerox PARC back in the day is the one that actually invented the graphical user interface that Apple borrowed or took inspiration from. Yeah. And Xerox PARC was a famous facility where Xerox, the corporation that makes copiers, hired a ton of brilliant researchers to study computing, artificial intelligence, man-made interfaces, and all that. And then Apple, of course, picked up on that. So Santa Fe Institutes like that, they've hired tons of brilliant people, but their specialty is math, physics, and complexity research, which is, how complex systems arise from simple numerical systems, things like that. And one of the things they talk about is, in this book, is all the research around scale. And the first thing he explains is like, okay, how does scale operate in physical systems, biological systems? So why is it that you have a mouse and they have a heart, they have organs, they have blood, and it pumps around, and you have an elephant or a whale, which is basically a very similar system, but scaled up. And how does the mathematics change? Because the way vascular systems work within the body, it's not a linear relationships, but there are relationships. There are mathematical curves that these systems follow, because there's a change between, say, 2D, which is the cross-section of 2D being a flat plane, the cross-section of a blood vessel, which is an area of a circle or an oblong or whatever, versus the volume and the outer circumference, which would be like the blood vessel. So like the size of one element goes up by a certain mathematical law, but the size of the volume and the capacity in 3D goes up by a different mathematical curve, because it's squares versus cubes versus whatever. And that has all kinds of interesting effects on the physical world. So how much blood can circulate in the body, how much oxygen can be exchanged between the cells in a mouse's blood vessels, which, the tiny one cell capillary, versus what happens in a larger animal where you have far fewer cells on the perimeter of the cell versus in the interior volume of the blood, right? So obviously, if you need to carry oxygen around, in a physical sense, the hemoglobin that has that oxygen attached to it has got to bump up against whatever so that the oxygen can transfer to the next thing that it touches. Anyway, all really interesting stuff. And once he covers these biological parameters, then they start saying, well, these mathematical laws pop up all over the place. And he talks about the way mapping and fractals works, like how you map a coastline. Like if you keep looking, there's more detail, more like the interface between and a map between where, okay, this is the end of California, the rest is the Pacific. You go down, oh, well, that's a beach. Oh, the shoreline. Oh, well, that's the interface of this water versus these sand molecules. Like it keeps, like you said, you can keep going down. Yeah. There's more to learn. There's more detail, and it never ends. So in fact, it's almost like the actual length can actually be infinite, even though we'd say, no, it's 10 miles from here to here.
Yeah. It's as deep as you want it to go.
Right. But
or for the purpose
but
of
also that
need.
There's the, like physics, there is a physical limit, a boundary point where at some point we say what's over that boundary doesn't affect things. Because in space, like, of course you can keep going till you touch the surface of the earth, or you can go in, but okay, well, where's the surface of the earth? Is it on this sand grain, or is it like a millimeter above like the average height of this piece of land, right? Like what's the altitude of the United States? You could ask somebody that. Well, I don't know. Well, we could average the height every square mile.
Yeah.
And then add all that. And that's the average height of the United States. But if we chose different measurements, we get a different answer.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the difference of that's why there's two different theories right now. We're trying to combine them, right? The theory of relativity, exactly what you're explaining, with altitude, what distance from the moon to the earth, as opposed to when you get into quantum physics, it's a whole different story.
Well, if you're in a plane, how high are you above the ground? Like literally, you could shine a laser from the plane down, and your altitude is technically actually going to be constantly changing, because there's going to be little variances of centimeters, millimeters,
for all
meters.
Purposes, right, of flight. Yeah,
I'm 10,000 feet in the air.
Yeah,
that's what I'm going to say, because I don't have time to think of the little details.
Well,
as long as I'm 10 feet over the ground, at least that's what I want, because otherwise I'm smushed.
Yeah. Right? Well, I mean, for the intensive purposes, right, of the equipment that you're using, it's going to say 10,000 feet, because it doesn't need to be that specific for the purpose of what you're doing or your intent.
But if you're trying to land a lander on the moon, and you're off by a little bit, all of a sudden your thing is smashing with, because it's a logarithmic scale. Now you're, we were only off by, a meter. Well, that meter allowed
it exponentially
grew the force of impact, and now your lander is in a million pieces.
So isn't that crazy? The intensity of how different stuff that you go into has to apply.
Right. Yeah. And that, again, people are not naturally wired to think in exponential terms, because the scales can rapidly change in a degree that people just don't intuitively understand.
Yeah.
And maybe that's evolution. Maybe, who knows? There's a million reasons
Yeah.
why that might be.
Yeah. I like how you mentioned the scale or the book. You said Scale Up.
The book is called Scale, and,
Scale,
and the guy's first name is Jeffrey. The thing is, since I had my stroke, it's harder for me to recall names. I notice like faces will pop in, celebrities and everything, but anything that involves a name of someone, it takes me longer to pull that information out of my brain, or it's just sometimes it's easier to go look it up. Like I've had conversations with my friend, and like a week later, the person's name pops into my head. That's who I was thinking. Yeah. Whereas before, I was like one of these trivia guys. Oh, who was in such and such a movie? Oh, that was blah, blah, blah. Okay. And, this was the director or whatever. Yeah. And now it's like, I know the answer's there, but it takes a lot of rerouting in my head to get to the answer.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And probably in a literal sense too.
Oh yeah. And it's really, it is about people's names. So the area of, my brain where the stroke happened that was damaged because of that. That's obviously where that is. And that's what I've been sort of trying to observe. What are the limits? Because obviously when something physical happens, you're looking for that effects. Like if your hand gets cut by a knife, you're looking to like, oh, how deep is the wound? How is this? Because then I know how I'm going to have to take care of it to heal it properly. Do I need stitches? Is this something that is an immediate threat, or is this something that I can overlook because I'm trying to, I'm right now in the middle of trying to save a sinking boat. So I'm not going to worry about how I cut my hand, right? Whereas if I'm painting a painting and I cut my hand, I do not want to get blood all over all the work I just did and destroy this painting. Yeah. Or maybe I start painting with my own blood and I'm like, oh, this is one of my really personal pieces.
Well, the canvas of life.
Yeah, the canvas of life. Yeah. Exactly. This is my canvas of life. See that bloody handprint? That's my blood.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, just you got to keep changing scale. This is why sometimes I can be very frustrating to talk to, because I'm always jumping around all over because I see all these connections
Well, it's good. It's good to be able to switch through those references. And I was going to go back to an original point, but I'll address this. Is that I've noticed too that, there's a certain way to where people are inherently kind of when you're talking to them, they already think a certain way, right? Yeah. And so maybe when you're wanting to open someone's mind about stuff, well, the best way to talk to someone is in the way of how they think, right? It's because, but also it's different because I can counter attack that right now where like when it comes to learning, right? And then we have these different modalities, which is a fancy word of all the different senses, right? And for learning, it's best when you're exposed to all of the modalities, where it's a kinesthetic, it's also hearing, it's also sight, right?
The more ways you can absorb the knowledge, the more thoroughly it's going to kind of penetrate your being.
Yes. So it is good, but then it's also good to know kind of how someone's already predestined to think a certain way. Not predestined is the wrong word. But like predispositioned, I guess. That's a better word.
Predisposed to think a certain way.
Yeah. But what I was going to go to is for it's funny because I've never talked about that on a podcast, but I've always thought of the world exactly like that, where every time you scale something up or down, there's a certain resonance or echo of something. Yeah. Where like I used to tell people where like they would say like, oh, like what does the universe mean to you? Or like do you what do you question. Yeah, it's like or like is there a God or something? And I'll always go back to where I think the way how the universe works is that when you go from a smaller scale to a bigger scale, it kind of just replicates the same thing. And I'll say like the cells in your body are all working towards a common goal, and they have a certain way of and what's crazy is that they're actually just born with it too. Like they just know what they're gonna do. Yeah. And then you get to the larger scale of a human being where it's like, well, now instead of cells, it's all these, like you have all these limbs that now have a common goal that can be achieved through something, right? And then, but you get a little more complicated. Now there's a brain, right? And then an entity of a business is really the exact same way, where there's a brain, there's the arms, there's the hands that are going out, there's the feet, right? And then you get to the earth. There's all these plants, right? And then they're all going towards a common goal of wanting to sustain, the earth and keep stuff alive.
Species wants to survive, right?
Yeah, but if it's like, it doesn't have to be, right? Like the earth necessarily, you can't think of it as like a living being, right?
Yeah.
And then you can get scalar to bigger, the solar system and the universe, right? But then I think that all connects into this big web of what the universe is, so scaling down and up and down, it's like, I've always thought about it without you referencing that, so that's really funny. But yeah, there's always an echo or a resonance of when you scale up and down, you're gonna see similarities, and then the way you think about it, you can kind of relate to stuff that I think happened in your life, because we are also part of that journey as when we look above and out beyond, right? Or within, right? Even to a smaller scale, I think it all, or your surroundings, it all reflects. It all reflects.
Exactly. Like you're going to see that, like you said, if the patterns repeat, that means when you look in a certain direction, you're going to see or learn some rule or come to some knowledge that you can apply back down at a different scale. So sometimes things are easy to see at certain distances. So you're going to look down at a cellular level and you're going to see something, oh, that gives me an idea for my business, which works at a bigger scale, that I can apply.
Yeah.
Or maybe you look at something, you're reading an article about, something like the solar system we talked about, and you're like, oh, I see some idea there that I could see it applying down at the scale of my business. Because again, like you said, those patterns are sort of self-similar, repeating fractals, however you want to term it. Jeffrey, I think it's West is the guy's last name. And what you would actually love about that book, and I recommend this to anyone, but it is, it's not a basic read because it's a lot of papers. And the papers are not necessarily academic, right? They're not like full of technical jargon, but they are not written for a general audience. They're like presenting the findings of certain kinds of research and things like that. But I think it's great. And the other thing that, so the last third of the book or quarter of the book or fifth or whatever it is how do these mathematical rules apply to the structures of cities? And that's research they've been doing. And then also to businesses and the life, because that's
so interesting that I mentioned that too.
Exactly. That's why as soon as you said that, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that part. At the end of the book, they talk about, they've been studying how all these theories apply to the scale and life cycles of corporations. If we think of them as sort of a living entity,
I think
not in the sense that they're like cellular, but the systems mirror the same systems that biological ones have. And so that's what's good. There's another one that I haven't gotten around to about human scale too, a book that by another guy that's similar, has scale in the name. I think it's called Human Scale. And that is a little bit more about the sort of how human beings deal with scale conceptually and putting human beings sort of in the middle layer. And so you think about architecture and cities and how people sometimes have trouble grasping, again, the size of crowds. And
what we were talking about earlier.
So it's that. In other words, how people live in an individual unit to a family unit to a city to a neighborhood, things like that. So sort of the way scale ties in there. Whereas the other book is more sort of a pure mathematical type things in physics. And because a lot of the complexity theory it's grounded in math, physics, like actual hard science. It's not just like, oh, we have this crazy, like they
Less
actually
philosophy.
they go out and test it. Like one of the ways they were able to test about the size of cities, growth patterns and networks, transportation, power networks and stuff, and find the laws that are associated with that was, well, now we live in an era where everyone has a cell phone. Now, this might get some people upset saying, oh, they're spying on us, but they were able to get hold of enormous global data sets of cell phone pattern usage. They anonymize everything. They're not like listening in on somebody's conversation. This is like aggregate data. And so then they could trace like how far does the average person travel each week for a job, to buy things, that. And they start finding these scale numbers, these not logarithms, but these curves popping up everywhere.
That
from
could
this-
even relate to biology too.
And it
later on.
relates right back to
Yeah.
biology. In other
Yeah.
words, so the reason they start with the book with blood and oxygen and breathing and those types of lymph node vessels
Mm-hmm.
and everything is because those are energy transportation networks.
Mm-hmm.
Your body operates in a way a city does. And cities have these networks of roads. And if you look at the patterns, they fall like blood vessels. There's not just somebody didn't draw a grid in your body to develop it. It evolved in a natural, efficient way. Heart
Mm-hmm.
at the center, the blood goes in there, then it gets distributed efficiently out to all the extremities. And if you look at a city, the network of roads and transportation that comes in, it follows all the same mathematical laws.
Yeah.
And then it turns out that because human beings live in these physical grids and physical world, you're actually not a mathematical concept. You're a living human being, and you have to get from one place to another on a road or a trail or whatever. They find, they follow the same mathematical laws. And that's the beauty of the book is you see everything everywhere. It's like the math and the numbers branch out and touch everybody like a blood vessels in your body.
Yeah.
And you can apply it to the size of companies, the size of cities, the way people socially network. And it might look crazy on the graph, like there's a node and it radiates and there's a big circle and it radiates.
Mm-hmm.
You see these graphs of social networks or the corporate ownership, right?
Mm-hmm.
The big corporate entity in the middle that owns everybody.
Yeah.
And it turns out it's the same kind of pattern.
Yeah.
Whether it's cities, transportation networks, energy networks, social networks, like they're all the same. They look different because the presentation's different.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard of a guy named Edward? I think it's Edward Tufte. He used to do visual presentation of information, charts and stuff. Like, how do we present data in a visual manner, a graph, a bar chart, a map, or whatever, that communicates effectively in multiple ways?
Mm-hmm.
So that when you look at it, you see and understand the data, not just as like, here's the value
number.
for this.
Yeah.
But you see, and one of the maps that he used to give away with his books was like a chart of the size of Napoleon's army throughout the Russian campaign. And you see this big black bar over here. And as it goes to the right, as he goes on the map physically to the different locations, and he gets beat up. He loses his people, by the way. Spoiler alert, Napoleon lost. He gets smaller and smaller. He hits Russia, and then it bounces off Moscow. And as he's retreating, so finally he's returning from his Russian campaign, and it's just a little thin line, and like everybody's dead, and which is what happened in real life. But it makes you understand the history in a different way, because now it's not just like, and then he lost this battle, and he lost this many men, and then eventually at Waterloo this happened and that happened. Sort of the usual list of bullet points or facts or whatever you might see in a history book.
It's more powerful the way it's presented.
It's presented in a visual manner that lets you understand not only where he went, because it's on a map, but also the numbers and how his army got beat up, because you're seeing this line shrink as it goes along and return.
That's interesting.
And he has all these different, like he's the grandfather of like visual presentation of information. He's not the only one. He just happened to be a very famous professor who consolidated, of course, a lot of observations and research and synthesized it into these presentations. So Edward Tufte is really cool for that kind of stuff. Like certain fields, they're famous people that you hear their name as that. But if you really look at what they're doing, you'll find it's usually connected to other artists, other fields, right? Because of all knowledge that we have in Western science, it's built on the previous people.
Yeah.
Right? People build on science. They add to the body of knowledge. Sometimes they're forging new things, or they rearrange or optimize some part in the past. But generally, you're adding on to it. You're building, and of course you get the crazy guy at the end of the street who's like, I got a whole new system of knowledge, and, all science is wrong. And this is what was revealed to me by the aliens. But,
Yes.
Really unlikely that that's true. Well, it's like there's a book called The Black Swan. Have you ever read that? Or a Black Swan? Nicholas, I want to say, I think it's Lebanese.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty sure. Anyway, he's a sort of, he calls himself a flaneur, but he's a sort of a philosopher, business guy. And he wrote a book about the probabilities of rare events, which is what the black swan is in reference to. He says, some events are really rare. They're like the black swan, right? The rare bird that every once in a while you get one.
Mm-hmm.
They happen. And so his point is that sometimes and eventually those rare things that we think are unlikely, they happen. Mm-hmm. There's always talk about the big earthquake in California. Oh, one's coming sooner or later. It's rare, but eventually one's going to happen. And the same thing, certain things like people discount. It's like when the lightning, we talked about lightning. Mm-hmm. It's rare, but it does happen.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you need to be prepared for that rare event and not discount it. And the reason he says that is because sometimes that rare event that is going to happen is so damaging and disruptive that you'd better have a plan for it, or it's, your company is going to go under. You're going to lose your shirt. And it sucks. But the thing is, you can't just entirely discount these events. You can't say they're never going to happen, because sooner or later they will happen. Mm-hmm. It's like the 2008 financial collapse, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, it never happened.
What's a business cycle?
And all that. Yeah. And the business cycle, exactly. A business cycle is like a natural cycle. Eventually something's going to repeat and happen. And you might say, oh, it's not going to happen this year. It's not going to happen tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And everybody says that all the time. The grasshopper wants to go relax. The guy's like, no, winter is eventually going to come.
Yeah.
And if we're not prepared, if we don't have our stockpiles, we'll get wiped out. Oh, no, it's fine. We can do it tomorrow. It's like, no, there is a real world. We live in a real world.
Yeah.
There are physical, real constraints to what happens. And if you just ignore those because it's unlikely or you don't think it's going to happen, it's safe not to worry about things every day, to waste your energy on things that are unlikely. But that doesn't mean you can just say they're never going to happen. You ignore what will happen if that happened. Now that comes around to climate change, which I know that can be a controversial topic for some people. But here's the thing. If you ignore it completely, mm-hmm. it's bad enough that it's going to impact everybody, because we live on a planet, which I know you haven't been in space, and I know most of the people listening haven't been in space, but if you've been in space, you see our planet, and we're all on that little ball with that little thin atmosphere.
Yeah.
And we have to share it.
Yeah.
That's just the physical reality of it. Who cares what your mental picture is, and you're where you happen to wind up in the lottery is the center of your universe.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way of saying it.
All live actually on this Earth, this rocky ball in space with the layer of life and a layer of gases that create our atmosphere and our oceans.
We have a rare atmosphere too compared to everywhere else.
Right. And that's the thing. Again, we are the black swan of the universe.
We are.
Earth. We're the rare event.
We are the weird thing.
But we are here.
Yeah.
And it is possible to pollute what we've got, which would be bad. I mean, do you shit where you sleep?
No. Maybe when I was like 4.
Yeah. I mean, we've all done it, and we know how unpleasant the result is. Peeing your bed, shitting your bed, making mistakes, right?
That's life.
Like, it happens, but do you want it to happen all the time? I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you ever saw Train Spotting, but when he goes through withdrawal from the heroin in the movie and he shits himself in the bed and all, it's like, oh my God. Okay. Yeah. Note to self, don't do that.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. Well, I think that's a good, I want to end with kind of what you were saying earlier, where it's like something's going to happen. And so something that came to me was an idiot with a plan will always outperform the genius with no plan.
Yeah.
So just doesn't matter how you are. It doesn't matter how you think. Just, if you write something down and you'll get it done. The universe has a way of rewarding people that.
Yeah. Take charge of your life.
Yeah.
Don't let life happen to you.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's easy.
No, it's not easy. It's
not
always
at
easier
all.
said than done.
Yeah, remember, nature wants to destroy you. I mean, nature
Yeah.
would like to see you dead.
Yeah.
If you don't go and breathe, and if you don't go and eat and find shelter to keep your body temperature the right thing, nature's going to kill you. It's like,
That's the
I
reality
don't
of
care
it.
who you think.
Yeah.
Like, nothing's going to protect you. The lions will eat you, the tigers, the bears, whatever.
Yeah.
The ocean will drown you. Like,
Yeah.
we have to fight against the natural forces to maintain our what we like to think of as our supremacy.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Well, Alex, this has been such a fun episode. I'm so glad we did this.
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
I feel like we only even barely touched.
I
on
know.
some of
Well, I
these
wanted to
things,
talk
'cause
over
aviation is
there's so
and
many
individual
topics, too.
businesses.
I wanted to
I
talk
didn't even
about the
mention
books
all my
too.
books, like the ones we
Yeah.
talked
I
about.
know.
Weren't even the ones I was going to recommend. Yeah.
Well, that means we have to make another podcast, and I would love for you to come on some other
Yeah.
time, because this definitely, I think a lot of people are gonna get a lot of. I hope someone will, and I think definitely from
Yeah.
someone listening to it will at least change their perspective on stuff
Yeah.
and gain something new.
And I think
Yeah.
kind of what we talked about, these bigger issues are actually really important. Like, get your mindset, start working on that, and then, yeah, of course, in the future we can talk about more specifics about what you can do with your business, how you can improve things, or more things specifically about aviation and the things that are unique to that industry and the passion that people have for it.
But it does start with the self, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does. I mean, we're all individuals trying to get along in the world. We're the ones that do things. The concepts don't do things by themselves. The world, it's human beings that do these things, right? You can say we have a responsibility to the earth we're on or not. I mean, I don't think that matters, but you can't deny the reality that we're the ones that create the world that we live in and experience.
Yeah, we do have an impact. I don't know how small it is compared to the vast universe, but it is something.
But
Yeah.
what we do has a big impact on our lives because we're operating at our scale, right?
That's true.
It's like
Yeah.
you slap somebody, yeah, they feel it. 'Cause you slapped them.
Yeah. You might go to jail. Yeah.
You might go to jail.
Yeah.
To accept responsibility for the consequences of your actions. Like,
Yes.
choose to do things and
Yes.
acknowledge, right? Freedom, individual. We live in America. We like to say we're individuals. We have the freedom to do whatever we want. Well, that also means accepting the responsibility for the way the world reacts to what we do.
Yeah, and the risks that
And the
you
risks,
take.
yeah.
Well, Alex, is there any way you want people to reach out to you, or any final thoughts? I mean, that was a good way, I think, to end that too. But
Yeah. No, I mean, that's it. I am working my job here, which we'll maybe talk about another time, because that's actually completely separate from why we wanted to talk today. I work in media. I'll just leave it at that. But of course, there's many interests and many other things that I want to do. But
yeah,
sharing and helping people along is part of one of the things of what we do here with the media. So we'll just leave it like that.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's a whole nother conversation.
No, yeah. Well, either way, thank you so much.
And thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is the From Ground to Great podcast, and this is your host, signing out.